Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Matthews. I'm a board member of the Canadian International Council in Montreal, and we're really pleased today to have a lunchtime briefing on the crisis in Ukraine, the possible conflict between Russia and Ukraine. If any of you have been following, a number of states have started to impose sanctions on members of the Russian government. Russia has agreed to the independence of two of the small republics within the Crimean part that used to be part of Ukraine. So this is really a hot issue, and there's a lot of concern about conflict and what are the wider security means for the world, but also what does it mean for Ukraine? It's a much watch issue, and it's certainly in the news. So we're really pleased today to have with us Marko Papic. For those of you who don't know Marko, he has roots in Montreal. I'm a board member of the Montreal branch of Canadian Council, and Marko lived here for a while. But just to give you his bio, he's currently now a partner and chief strategist at Clock Tower Group, which is an alternative investment asset management firm based in Santa Monica, California. And he leads the firm's strategy, providing bespoke research to clients and partners on geopolitics, macroeconomics, and markets. Prior to that, he founded BCA Research's geopolitical strategy practice in 2012 in Montreal. And Marko began his career as a senior analyst for Stratfor, a global intelligence agency, where he contributed to the firm's global geopolitical strategy, as well as its analysis, recruitment, and training program. And to say not least, if you haven't caught it, he's also the author of Geopolitical Alpha, an investment framework for predicting the future. So Marko, great to have you with us today. Great to have you virtually reconnect to the Montreal and Canadian community. Maybe I'd like to just start off and just get your initial reactions, give you a couple minutes to talk about what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, and then we'll have a discussion between the audience about other questions.
Super. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to what I consider my home, which is the Quebec community, Montreal, and of course, Canada. I didn't just live in Montreal. I also went to the University of British Columbia. And, I'm originally from Yugoslavia, from Belgrade, Serbia, but I've lived in a lot of different places. And whenever I don't have enough time to explain my kind of origin story, I just say I'm from British Columbia. So, great to be speaking with you guys. I just want to say, before I give you my thoughts, I want everyone to understand what kind of analysis I do for a living. I do geopolitical analysis, but focused on the markets and the impact of politics and geopolitics, to securities, to equities, bonds, public and private markets. And that means that sometimes my analysis can seem callous or, not focused on solutions. That's because I'm genuinely trying to price markets and guess whether assets should be bought or sold based on geopolitical issues. I do think that this gives me a differentiated perspective, because I really need to be unbiased when I do this research. My clients, my investors expect me to predict market moves, not who wins or loses or who is in the right or who's in the wrong. And that's why I'm not going to start off with history. I'm not going to go back to 800 AD and talk about the Kievan Rus, or talk about, who's in the right or who's in the wrong. What I want to talk about is what I think is happening based on the reality on the ground. My framework also is focused on objective reality and material constraints to policymakers. A lot of the media is focused on the intentionality or the preferences of policymakers. But in my experience, in the book you reference, and thank you for that plug, Geopolitical Alpha, it really talks about this idea that the only way for us to really predict policymakers without having access to human intelligence or signal intelligence that government agencies do. So we as investors, what do we have to rely on? We have to rely on material constraints, sort of the things that prevent politicians from doing what they want to do. And that's where the mantra of my framework really comes through. Preferences are optional and subject to constraints, whereas constraints are neither optional nor subject to preferences. And that's something to kind of keep in mind as I give my views. I think what's happening here has very little to do, first and foremost, with Ukraine's NATO membership. I think that that's not an issue, almost at all. I think Russia's using that as an excuse to bully Ukraine and to try to divide the West, specifically divide Western Europe, continental Europe, the sort of non-Anglo-Saxon Europe, Germany and France, from the United Kingdom and the United States. And it's doing that because, look, the worst kept secret in diplomacy, in diplomatic circles, is that there is like no way in hell Ukraine will ever join NATO. Let me just like make that clear. I have an 86-page chart back that I will gladly eat in front of every one of you with some hollandaise sauce if Ukraine ever joins NATO. That's a very, very high conviction view. And this is because Germany and France have effectively been vetoing Ukraine's membership. The Budapest summit, the sort of fateful 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, that many people reference as the moment when NATO membership was promised, was nothing but that. In fact, what happened at that summit is that the United States was pushing for Georgia and Ukraine to be admitted to sort of the first rung of NATO membership, and Germany under Angela Merkel said absolutely not. There's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, there's criteria for joining NATO that require, things like corruption, level of democracy. Ukraine doesn't meet any of those. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean that in an objective. We can actually go to World Bank development indicators and note that Ukraine doesn't meet any of this criteria. Second of all, at one of the summits in the 1990s, it was basically agreed that NATO member states should enter the alliance, the military alliance, without any territorial disputes. For example, Croatia was almost denied membership because of a silly little, dispute it had with Slovenia. So NATO does not really admit countries with territorial disputes. Now, obviously, exceptions can be made, but it's not up to the White House. It's not up to Ottawa. It's not up to Westminster to make those exceptions. Every single NATO member state has to ratify a new member. Every parliament of every member state has to ratify membership. So what is this about then? Well, first of all, Putin is not asking for a contractual, proof or evidence or some sort of an agreement. If he was, he would himself be irresponsible. I mean, first of all, he has completely torn up several international agreements that his signature is on. I mean, the Minsk agreement, he just completely destroyed that. So why would he want an agreement himself? Russia has also abrogated the Budapest agreement, which, basically where Russia guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, completely walked all over that. And why would Moscow want Washington's signature on anything? Washington has just completely torn up an international agreement it signed with Tehran, the JCPOA. Why? Because, Donald Trump woke up on the wrong side of the bed, said, I don't like what Obama did. That doesn't matter. So Putin would be irresponsible or stupid if he actually believed that America would abide by some sort of a signature where it promised that Ukraine would not enter NATO. So what this is really about, I think, is two kind of, is three things that Russia wants from the West. One is very mundane, petty, and I think most of you will scoff when I say it. No way, it can't be that, but it is. Nord Stream 2, very important. Nord Stream 2 is 55 BCM. Okay, 55 BCM, that's a quarter of all exports to Europe by Russia. A quarter of all natural gas exports. That's a really big pipeline. It was very difficult to build, somewhere between $10 and $20 billion worth of investment by Gazprom. And it's been held up by Europe for a number of different reasons. That's the number one thing that Putin wants. Yes, it sounds petty. Yes, it seems weird and like not profound, and it doesn't fit the narrative that Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union, but this is vital to Russian national security interests. The second thing that I think Putin wants is an acceptance that Ukraine will be neutral. But it's not something that White House can give him. It's not something Berlin or Paris can give him. It's only Kiev that can give that to him. And he accomplishes that by bullying Kiev. And he's doing that by destroying Ukraine's economy. That's something that hasn't been written enough, hasn't been mentioned enough. This entire episode, this pressure, this constant bullying of Ukraine is destroying Ukraine's economy as we speak. Why? Because Swiss Air, Lufthansa have stopped flights. Investors are pulling out. Foreigners are pulling out. This is not an environment where consumer and business sentiment will do well for Ukraine. And so this can continue in perpetuity while Putin essentially slowly starves Ukraine's economy. What Russia wants from Ukraine is an acceptance that Finlandization will happen. And I refer obviously to the deal that Finland made with Russia in 1939 after the war they held, where they actually held the Soviets to a stalemate. Finland gave up 10% of its territory, gave up the second largest city of Finland, Viborg, which was depopulated by the Finns, in exchange for the ability to conduct domestic politics and economics on their own free will, not geopolitics. This is what Putin definitely wants from Ukraine. Now, from the West, especially the Anglo-Saxon West, you hear a lot of sort of scoffing, like, well, you can't have neutral countries. Like Russia wants everyone to be neutral on their borders and so on. Like this is inappropriate. There's no spheres of influence. And it's like, well, yeah, there are. Like there are spheres of influence. And yes, this is what happens in the real world. At some point, the West is either going to be honest with Ukraine and tell Ukraine what I'm telling you, which is that they will never have security guarantees from the West, not serious ones anyways, and that Ukraine should sit down at the table with Russia and find some sort of an equilibrium that allows them to pursue their own domestic policy, politics, and economics while satisfying Russia's security dilemma that clearly exists given Ukraine's close alliances with the West. That's the second thing that I think Russia wants. The third thing that Russia wants is actually, I think, a grand bargain with the West. And this is something that is not really written about in the media, and certainly I haven't heard any diplomat really talk about it. But Putin's speech, which was covered in a very sort of antagonistic manner, and it was very antagonistic, it did have little hints as well. Like I asked Clinton to join NATO in 2000, and he looked at me dryly, or whatever Putin said. I think these are important little tidbits. I think Russia realizes it has a very interesting moment at this point. Russia can be the wedge between China and the US, and it's basically up for the highest bidder. And since April of last year, Russia has conducted a number of campaigns that are meant to illustrate to the West the benefit of working with the Kremlin. First was the April 2021 massing of troops on Ukraine's border. Then there was that completely made for CNN migration crisis where Russia basically, flew migrants to Belarus-Poland border. Then there was the August 2021 draining of Gazprom natural gas storage facilities. And then, of course, in November of 2021, we began with this crisis now. So this isn't just about Ukraine. This is about Russia wanting a grand deal, a deal where it is paid to basically move away from China. Now, that's speculation on my part. Clearly Russians are doing it in a weird way if they're trying to woo the West. They're not doing it in a very reasonable way. But given Russia's history and given sort of institutional paranoia that I think Russia as a country has in terms of security issues, this is the way they negotiate, in my view, in my humble view. Will there be an invasion of all of Ukraine? I don't think so. I think that is Western propaganda. So I would align with, President Putin on that one. I think that this whole, it's coming in 24 hours. It's here. Like 10 days ago, it was supposed to happen. Then again, before the Olympics and after the Olympics, then, like after the Great Fatherland holiday, then maybe tomorrow, then in 48 hours. All right, look, let's sit back and think about it. Russia has had hundreds of thousands of troops poised on the borders of Ukraine, ready to invade the whole country, and they haven't done that. Why? Is Putin a child? Does he need some sort of a pretext, an excuse to invade a country? He hasn't really needed that in the past. There is a reason that Russia hasn't invaded all of Ukraine. And I think it's because the costs of that operation would be incredibly, incredibly painful for Russia, for domestic politics, and for Putin himself. And so I do think that a limited incursion that we've seen thus far is probably the most we're going to get. Potentially what we might get is some sort of a hybrid intervention where Russia replicates the 1999 NATO air war against Serbia or its own intervention in 2008 in Georgia, where it signals a large-scale operation and then withdraws to just Donetsk and Luhansk. But I think that Russia is accomplishing a lot of what it wants just by putting pressure and by bullying Kiev and by destroying Ukraine's economy. It's trying to bring Kiev to the negotiating table where basically Ukraine cries uncle and says, yes, we will be neutral and our geopolitical ambitions will be scaled down. Anyways, those are my thoughts. As I said, I try to predict the markets, so I'm going to cut through a lot of noise and a lot of political correctness too. So, I know the history. I don't need a history lesson. If I insulted anyone, I'm really, really sorry, but this is how analyze the markets.
We're here to have discussions, Marko. So you've talked about what are the geopolitics behind this conflict and what are Russia's interests. I'm wondering if you could, and you said that Ukraine has to balance its geopolitical interests with living next to Russia, but I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about what this means for other Central European states, because there is a history of the Soviet Union, of being occupied through the Soviet system, and really people wanting their independence. So how will this affect Poland or the Baltic states or other countries that are in between Western Europe and close to Ukraine?
Well, I think since the beginning of the accession process into the EU, it's been very clear what the intentionality of the sort of Visegrad Group, Central Eastern European countries is, and it's to extend the border further east. That's why, for example, Poland took the leadership of the European Union Eastern Partnership Program, which was designed to kind of prepare former Soviet Union countries to join the EU. The intentionality here, if you are running the Baltic states, or if you're running Poland, or if you're in Romania and Transnistria is not far away, which has Russian troops in it, like, what do you want? You want Ukraine to join so that it can be on the border. You want to extend the border. This is a very logical, very rational thinking of Central Eastern European countries. If I was running Poland, I would want the same thing. The problem with this is that if you're running Ukraine, you have to understand that these countries don't necessarily have your best interests at heart. They just want you to be the border with Russia. But are they going to go and fight for you if Russia invades? And we have the answer, like, literally right now. Germany sent helmets. Poland is getting Abrams tanks, not to walk into Ukraine, but to defend itself. F-35s are coming to the Baltic states, not to help you, but to defend the Baltic states. And so that would be my answer. I mean, Central Eastern European countries are pursuing their interests. God bless them. They're doing the right thing from some sort of a geopolitical imperative perspective. But I would argue that very few of these countries have actually thought out what is in the best interest of Kiev. They simply want Kiev to be out in front of Russia.
So, Marko, to maybe talk on another subject, and you gave an interview with CNBC about this. Maybe could you talk about, are we seeing any disinformation unfolding that is trying to shape a false narrative of what's going on? What are your views about this, about disinformation campaigns and the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Well, Russians have been conducting, disinformation campaign for a very long time, across, multiple channels, from RT to Sputnik to various other forms. And I think that most of it has, for the most part, been par for the course. I think what's concerning to me is a kind of a sharp change in a lot of the narrative. And that occurred in 2014 with, for example, this idea that there was a threat to Crimea and to the Russian ethnics from, roving bands of neo-Nazi militants who were coming to ethnically cleanse Russians. So that happened then. Now there's this kind of like historical disinformation campaign of like what parts of Ukraine were gifted to Ukraine by Lenin and Stalin, and so on and so on. And that's worrying because the disinformation campaign is taking on a different tone. When Russians are just bitter at the West, where they're resentful and where they use that in disinformation, that's okay. God bless them. They have the right to do that. And that's been kind of their standard operating procedure. Well, you promised NATO wouldn't expand, and then you did. So you guys broke the rules first. When it becomes, though, about revisionist history and about Russian ethnic superiority, I think that's when we have to pay attention, because unlike my homeland, Yugoslavia, which broke apart and immediately went into ethnic conflict, Soviet Union didn't do that. Soviet Union broke apart, but for the most part, other than Caucasus and a few other regions of the Soviet Empire, for the most part, the breakup wasn't about ethnicities, who's who speaks what language. And I'm worried that there is now a tonal shift slowly creeping into the narrative. Now, the good news, though, is that if you look at the polling suggests that most Russians themselves do not want to unify with Ukraine. So CNN had actually a really good poll, to CNN's credit, which I rarely give, had a recent poll that showed that only like 36% of Russians, and this was conducted by a local polling agency, only about 36% of Russians actually want to unify with Ukraine, which is still probably a lot, but it's lower than you would expect. And so that's where I think the disinformation campaign is getting a little bit different than it was in the past. But I would also say there's disinformation campaign in the West as well. I think that we need to step back and understand that, for example, when you look at how French media or German media is covering this and the American media, there is a world of difference. And I think that it reflects the reality that there won't really be a blowback to the United States if there's a wide-scale conflict in Ukraine. The blowback will happen to Western Europe. That's where the refugees are going to go. That's where the energy costs are really going to skyrocket. And so I think that the US is instigating and is acting as sort of like a poking the bear a little bit, which again, to America's credit, that's in its interest. I mean, if the Putin regime was to break on the rock of Ukrainian resistance, like that's not necessarily a bad thing for the United States in the long term from a geopolitical perspective. And so I think that the US has much more bandwidth and room to maneuver in its own rhetoric towards Russia, whereas you would notice that in Western Europe, the tone is much, much more different.
So before I go to my last question, Marko, I just want to remind people following online, if you're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, you can pose a question. They'll appear on the screen. I'll read them to our guest. But maybe going back to, you say you analyze markets, the geopolitical impacts of markets. How will this conflict, Marko, impact financial markets and global stability? I mean, if it turns into a wider conflict that you don't think is going to happen, but if it does, what will that mean? We're seeing sanctions placed against Russian officials by Western states, by Japan. Where could this go, and how could the markets be affected?
So in my book, I have this table in one of the first chapters, and it shows every single global military conflict and how insignificant it was for the markets. So basically, you should just close your eyes and buy risk assets every time there is a war. Period. End of sentence. End of story. Good night. Except on the table, there is one conflict that caused lasting damage to the markets, and that was the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Now, Yom Kippur War, had it happened in a different macro context, would have been forgotten by investors. It would have been irrelevant. But what happened was that there was basically 5-6 years of an inflationary buildup, inflationary context. It started with the Vietnam War fiscal spending. It started with the Great Society program of LBJ. 1971 Nixon shocks, trade war. He imposed a 10% surcharge on all imports. It was resolved through the Smithsonian Agreement, which collapsed the dollar. So there were these inflationary pressures building up from 1966 to 1973. And the Fed started raising rates in 72 to try to counter them. And then that Yom Kippur War just came at the wrong time. It was a cherry on top of an inflationary sundae. And so it's not that the actual OPEC embargo caused inflation. It just came at a worst possible time. And I do think that there is a scenario, even if Marko Papic assigns a low probability to a wide-scale conflict, who cares? First of all, it's me. Why would you believe my forecast? But second of all, I think the danger is that even if the probability is low, the potential impact, given the current inflationary context, is massive. It is truly massive. And that's why I think we should worry about this, because Russia has ample current account surplus, the largest it's had in over a decade. It's rebuilt its currency reserves since 2014. It's at $550 billion. So it has ample ammunition to impose an embargo on critical supply chain components. Not necessarily oil or natural gas. I don't think they would do that, but I do think that they could impose embargo on nickel, on palladium, on things that we need to build various components. And that's just the worst thing that the markets need right now, when the Fed is already struggling to deal with inflation.
So Marko, we have one question coming in. I'm going to put it on the screen so you can read it, but I'll read it out loud. So Akash Maharaj says, Transparency International says Kremlin actors own 1.5 billion of UK real estate. The UK has sanctioned only 5 Russian banks and 3 individuals. Why aren't states moving seriously against Putin's corrupt enablers?
Yeah, first of all, I think Transparency International has to 10x that figure. Like 1.5 billion? Come on, that's like peanuts. Maybe they own that much in downtown Montreal, man. Come on. Like, that's like the worst figure I've ever seen in my life. I have no idea, but that's a great point. And I mean, look, the only way that I can explain this lack of action on the issue of oligarchs is that a lot of people in the United Kingdom make a lot of money off of this. I mean, that's it. which again goes back to my point. Let's be honest here. Like, let's be honest to Ukrainians. We don't care enough about them. Like, I mean, that's the first thing. That's the best thing the West can be. Like the United Kingdom, especially, which is like pretty hysterical when it comes to this whole situation relative to other European countries. The United Kingdom should just be honest. Like, look, we just don't want to sanction the wealthy Russians that bring a lot of money into this country. Right? Germany should be honest. Like, here's some helmets, you know, like that's all we're going to send you. If the West was honest to Ukraine, I think this situation would probably get resolved with Kiev and Moscow sitting down at a table and hashing out some sort of an agreement. But that hasn't happened. But Zelensky, by the way, the president of Ukraine is not dumb, and he has been basically inferring this throughout this whole crisis. He's been saying to the U.S. specifically, you need to tone down your rhetoric. But also he's been basically saying, like, you guys should just tell us if you don't want to see NATO. That's a direct quote from President Zelensky, and I think he's absolutely right. The West should be honest. One other thing I would want to add is, you know, when we think about preferences and constraints of actors, one way to think about it is we can take Putin's preferences to be maximalists. Like, he wants to annex Ukraine. He wants Anschluss. Okay, let's just take that as a given. What you do then, as an analyst, is you subtract the real action he's actually done so far. So you take the preference minus action, that equals constraints. And so we can assume that his preference, which I don't think it is, but let's assume it is Anschluss with Ukraine. And then you subtract the fact that he hasn't done it yet, and he's actually been pretty paltry. I mean, this move into rebel-held Donetsk and Luhansk, I mean, come on. Does that really change the situation on the ground? There's already Russian troops unofficially in rebel-held areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. So given his preference and given what he has done so far, either he is just slow playing it, which might be the case, then I'll be wrong, or there are constraints, material constraints, to him being able to effectively pursue those preferences. And those constraints are very important, and we need to analyze them and think about them, because it means that, you know, the worst case scenario may not happen.
So Marko, you've given us a lot to think about. There's no other questions coming in from the audience, but we are right at the 30-minute mark. So, and we know you're very busy. So on behalf of the Canadian International Council, I want to thank you for joining us, to giving us a big picture analysis from your perspective and from your specific views and working in these areas. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you for the invitation.